Hello. Over the past few weeks, I've shared with you a few milestones that we've reached. We recently crossed the 20,000 and are rapidly moving towards 25,000 downloads. According to Listen Notes, The Voices of War is still trending in the top 3% of all podcasts globally. So if you haven't yet given us a 5-star rating or written a review, maybe consider doing that now. If easier, maybe you can share this episode with your followers on social media. Okay, let's go and meet our next guest, a former colleague of mine and a dear friend, Arjan Verdooren. My guest today is Arjan Verdooren, who has a background in communication studies and works as a consultant and lecturer in the field of intercultural communication and competence. He is associated with the Royal Tropical Institute, a knowledge center in Amsterdam, and until recently lectured at the Master in Communications program at University of Gothenburg. He is the co-author, together with Dr Edwin Hoffman, of the book Diversity Competence, Cultures Don't Meet, People Do, which is a deep dive into improving our individual and collective intercultural competence. Arjan has authored various other publications on intercultural communication, intercultural competence, cultural diversity, and multiculturalism. Throughout the 15 years he has spent in the field, he has consulted with various organizations ranging from state departments to multinationals and NGOs on harnessing more effective international and intercultural cooperation. He is a frequent speaker on these topics and is someone who connects theory with practitioners facing intercultural situations every day in the field. Arjan, it is a great pleasure to host you. Welcome to the Voices of War.
Thanks very much. It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation, and I've been looking forward greatly to this.
And I think a full disclosure is in order as well. So right. I've mentioned you and discussions from you, and I've quoted you on this podcast, at least 4 or 5 times, particularly as cultures don't meet, people do. And for my audience, Arjan and I we were colleagues back at the University of Gothenburg. He was there for a fair bit longer than me, but we were colleagues lecturing. I was particularly focused on interpersonal communication, and Arjan was on intercultural, but I certainly helped out on some of his lessons as well.
Absolutely.
So we go some way back, and we have chewed over this topic many a time.
We do. It's not the first time we talk about it. I guess that's for the full disclosure, safe to say, right?
Yeah, exactly right. So maybe to get us started, what brought you into the field of culture and intercultural communication in the first place?
Right. That's always an interesting question, and makes me wonder where to start. But I'll since we started full disclosure, I go all the way back. Mm-hmm. So it's also my experience that many people working in this field have some kind of personal background or personal motive why they ended up there. As you may or may not have been able to tell by my name, I'm from the Netherlands, and for some reason, intercultural communication is quite big in the Netherlands. I don't really know why that is.
I was actually going to ask you that, but
okay. Well, we'll save that for later.
We've got Trompenaars and
exactly, all the big guys.
Hofstede, all the big names.
And anyway, back on topic. So I grew up in Amsterdam, which, for the record, according to many statistics, is the most multicultural city in the world, measured by the amount of nationalities, at least. I myself grew up in a mixed Dutch-Indonesian family. My father was born and raised in Indonesia, as Indonesia was a colony of the Netherlands for a very long time. Some listeners might know, especially the ones in Australia.
Yeah.
And I grew up in a suburb to Amsterdam, which is has a bit of a reputation, I guess you could say, comparable to, let's say, the Bronx or Harlem in New York, for being very multicultural. Also known for, I guess, a lot of big city problems. And in spite of their reputation, I had a very happy childhood there. I grew up in an environment with, I guess, characterized by diversity, I guess you could say, already back in the 80s, right? So before this was politicized. And for me, this was the natural state for me. This was for me very normal. And it took me a while when I grew up to realize this was not normal to many other people. And I guess there was a shift in the Netherlands, which happened in many European countries. But I think the shift in the Netherlands was very extreme, going from a let's say, general discourse politically and a general policy to a large extent that promoted multiculturalism, that saw it as something positive. I'm not saying this was always profound, but at least this was the official rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
And then came September 11th. And there have been analysts that have said there's no country where the political shift has been as radical after September 11th as in the Netherlands.
Oh, wow.
We don't have to deep dive for the reasons for that, but the discourse very much shifted to, from, this is something positive and we should cherish this, to we need to acknowledge this as a problem. Multiculturalism has failed. Integration, whatever it may be, has failed. We need to emphasize all the problems and the shadow sides of this situation. At that point, I was graduating, and I realized deeply that both intellectually, but also personally, this was something that affected me, because my reality under which I had grown up all of a sudden came under fire, all of a sudden was problematized. And of course, I was willing to discuss it on any kind of level and acknowledge that there are challenges. But it went into an direction that was very extreme, this kind of us versus them scenario. And I found that, to be honest, I found it intellectually and academically compelling, but it also personally affected me. And it was just when I was graduating and trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. And at that point, I didn't really have a clue. I think my best guess was to become a sports journalist because I liked football and I liked journalism. But then,
well, you're from the Netherlands, so that's a given. Yeah,
right. Let's talk about this week's football results. No, let's not. Another Amsterdam side of me, but yeah. So that came together, and I guess I didn't expect necessarily that I would work with it. I guess I'm halfway in my career or something, and still be working with it. Here I am. Yeah.
There's definitely one thing. I mean, I know you said that we don't have to deep dive into it, but I'm really interested when you said that, the Netherlands was the discourse, social discourse shifted most radically post 9/11. Why is that the case? I mean, without going too deeply into it, but that's especially given the location of the Netherlands in Europe, and its multicultural base. Why was that the case?
Right. I mean, to be honest, there's only guesses, but there's probably estimated guesses and less estimated guesses. But I think part of the reality is that it wasn't as good as we'd like to think. So the Netherlands has this image and strong self-image of tolerance, of diversity. It's partly profound, but as with any image, there is a performative aspect to it, right? Where we like to believe that of ourselves so much, and we cherish this image, in spite of that the reality may not always meet, that standard. And even historically, if we look back on that, there's many instances where you can say, well, the Netherlands wasn't as tolerant or that accepting of difference or whatever you want to call it. In reality, I mean, look, like we just mentioned the colonial past, right? I mean, so there's many instances where that self-image was very flattering, even though in other ways, it might be profound, but in other ways it was way too self-flattering. So I think that just fell apart. That's part of it. And the other side is that I think one of the explanations is particularly that, of course, September 11th and later other events in the Netherlands mainly had to do with Islamism, with radicalism, with jihadism. And the Netherlands has a history of rebelling against religion as such. So the Netherlands was the most religious country in Europe, measured by church attendance in the early 20th century, and almost completely secularized, but strongly rebelled against that in the 1960s because people felt they were suffocating in these small religious communities because there was also religious pluralism. So there was no state religion, but there were a lot of different conjugations and subcurrents of religion that were all accommodated, meaning that people lived in these small religious communities, felt they were suffocating, rebelled against it in the 60s, and there was a strong kind of secular, but I would even say anti-religious current. And this was, I think, a bit suppressed at the same time with this notion of multiculturalism and tolerance. But once September 11th happened, I think, this current just got momentum.
Yeah.
And there was no...
And it had some right
There's
ground,
no other Western... Sorry. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It had some right ground. Yeah.
There was no other Western country with as strong a backlash. And I'm talking about a violent backlash in terms of, violence against mosques, Islamic shops, Islamic schools, as the Netherlands. There's been a great number of incidents, which is something often goes unheard, but that did happen.
Yeah, I actually had no idea. That is really interesting to hear.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also interesting to hear that I guess the 60s, which I guess would then make sense, would at least in part explain why there are so many really big names in the intercultural space that are from the Netherlands, right? Because if that was the push, to rebel against this kind of echo chambers and try, and of course globally, that was also the kind of growth of the idea of diversity, etc. But I think also culture finds its roots, or maybe I should ask you the question: where does the idea of culture come from?
Right.
Or us studying
That's
culture?
a really good question, and one I really like to talk about, which is a good bridge to the field of intercultural communication as well, because I think it really helps our understanding of the some of the challenges actually if we know where that whole notion comes from, right? So people didn't come falling from the sky talking about culture. We didn't, we weren't born using that word. We learned it somewhere, and it originates from somewhere. And I think, I'm not a historian, but I think the most useful time frame is to go back to the time of nation building and the time of late colonialism, which kind of coincided more or less. And until that point, the word culture was used, but it was used in a kind of gradual sense in terms of you have more or less culture. So culture was almost a synonym for civilization, right? So obviously in the colonial system, there was this idea of there's the civilized and the less civilized and even the uncivilized. And part of that was, it was known as the white man's burden of the colonial powers was to civilize, half civilized and to some degree the uncivilized. There was discussion of whether that was possible. So culture was something that you had to a low, more or lesser degree. And then enter a revolutionary group of people, I guess, in this sense, which was the cultural anthropologists, early anthropologists like Margaret Mead and Malinowski and these kind of people, who, in the time when there was discussion and some decolonization movements started to happen, and they started to study these groups that supposedly were uncultured and uncivilized, and they came with a literary revolutionary conclusion, which is it's not that these people have less culture than we do. It's just that they have an entirely different culture than we do. They have a different system of meaning making of their everyday lives, which is just as complex and just as profound as ours, but it's just different. And because we are used to seeing the world in our way, we don't recognize this. We see them as uncivilized, but they're highly civilized in their own way. And I really like to call this literally a revolutionary idea, because if you take that to heart and you accept that, it means that you come to the conclusion of if that is the case, they have the right over their own destiny. Who are we to try to civilize them? So it was a very profound, a very revolutionary idea. And I like to think of, if we look at the field also of intercultural communication, and I think many of our common sense and political discussions about culture, this is still how we view culture, right? It's something that people are encapsulated into, defines who they are, defines their reality, and makes them profoundly different from, let's say, us. And I think to some degree, this idea is still useful, but more and more people, including myself, have started to say, well, fair enough. This was an important argument, an important revolutionary idea. But the world that we live in nowadays looks at the same time vastly different than that of the early anthropologists. So we need to come to terms at the same time with the reality that, yes, on the one hand, it's a useful concept, but we need to be aware of the pitfalls at the same time. And I think it's interesting. I didn't think about this before, but it's a nice, how do you call it? It comes back to the discussion we had about multiculturalism. I think one of the things that failed or that made it difficult in the Netherlands was there was this push of this narrative of we need to accept these people because they have these entirely different cultures, right? So what is known as we culturalized that situation. We saw everything through the lens of cultural difference, which also meant that the moment that we associate this with problems, and we see there's problems in multicultural societies, the inevitable conclusion is, well, if we need to respect them for their difference, if these people, they, us versus them, if they cause problems, it's also because of their cultures. So we need to push back on that. We need to reject it. And to some degree, we even need to push it out. So we need to wonder if that whole narrative, that whole discourse, that whole story about culture, again, one of my main convictions is all ideas exist in a certain political and historical time, which we need to use to understand that idea. We need to understand how useful that is, and we need to update, I think, our cultural concept to the current situation where people don't live in, let's say, on different cultural islands, on different continents anymore, but we live together, either literally because we live in the same street, or because we are connected through the internet and through other affiliations throughout the world, much more deeply than we were 100 years ago.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, I mean, it all started with cultural relativism. I guess we realized that culture, as we come to understand it, is relative to the ecosystem within which it exists, or in fact, culture is the ecosystem, right, that we find in a different place. And whilst that is a noble recognition, and I think that afforded many of the victims of colonization a voice, I guess, there are also issues that come with it, right? There are issues with cultural relativism, I think, and if, I mean, it's in a globalized world, it's very difficult for us to stand by to and say it's okay that certain cultural practices, as they come to be described, female genital mutilation being one, that we can accept that, right? As, hey, it's merely the culture.
Right.
So how do we deal with that?
Right.
So because that's the issue that I think you're alluding to, right? That we're blending.
Absolutely. That's a profound issue, and it's actually one of the issues we try to address in our book. So I feel that in the field of intercultural communication, again, strongly has its roots in this, as you very rightfully say, this notion of cultural relativism, as, again, which you can summarize, it's not less or better or worse, it's just different, right? Which has its merits, but as you say, has also its limitations, because then all of a sudden we need to cooperate and coexist, and it becomes a lot more difficult than to just say, like, oh, I'll let it go because that's their culture. And it can even lead to this kind of fight or flight reaction, I think, that we're seeing towards multiculturalism by saying, well, if that's their culture, then, let them go back. So in our book, we try to distinguish between different frameworks, like thought frameworks or ideas about this notion of ethics, which is basically what it comes down to in intercultural affairs. And the first frame of reference will be what we call universalism, which is the notion that there is one system of thought, of ideas, of norms, basically, which is superior compared to others, which sounds really bad, right? It sounds like what we talked about before with colonialism, but doesn't need to be, right? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of course, is a universalistic system of thought. And I think universalism sometimes has a bad rep, but it has its merits if, I think, it's something that we also project on our own so-called culture. If we also agree that, there's an argument to say that gender equality should be universal, merit or value we aspire to, which means that we can criticize groups for not living up to that. But the boomerang comes back if we then look at ourselves and say, well, we're probably not perfect ourselves, right? I think in that sense, universalism could work, but it very easily deteriorates into something we call monism, which basically means there's one frame of reference, one set of ideas and norms, which is better and happens to be mine, right? And then you're right back at square one.
There's a power dynamic deeply embedded within the idea of universalism, and that's just that it's my way or the highway kind of thing. Exactly.
And it can even become paternalistic, right? Because it's better for you to become more like me. Trust me on this, right? So it becomes assimilationist or even colonialist, right? Again, the white man's burden was basically driven by that idea. So it has its merits, but it has its strong pitfalls. And then again, relativism came as a way to kind of counter that. And again, you need to see that in a time and makes people aware of profound differences in our experience, profound differences in our meaning-making systems and the symbols we use and how we understand the world. And it has the implicit notion of, or often actually explicit notion that the way to deal with that is acceptance and tolerance. But as you just said, and female genital mutilation is the archetypical example of that.
That's right.
Maybe things that we can't live with.
See, I'll just jump in there because I think this particular point will resonate with a lot of my audience, because just about every military member that has deployed to, the Middle East, Afghanistan, places that function vastly differently to what we're used to in the Western world. Right. Just about every one of those people will come back or has a story where they've experienced that very idea of cultural relativism and how painful that is. Now, some even come back with moral injury because of it, because they were put in a position where they were forced to observe something that in our culture would be abhorrent, the way, say, children would be treated or, women would be treated. But in many ways, they couldn't do anything. Their hands were tied because it wasn't their place to, change people's culture. So this is something, this idea of this clash is something that's real, that's experienced by, and I'm sure it's not just soldiers. I'm sure it's people in the development industry as well. In the medical profession who go overseas to help. This is a real issue. This cultural relativism, when you face with it there and then, can have a profound impact on someone. But sorry, you were about to say something. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just wanted to kind of double click on that point, because I think it's a really, really, really important piece of this idea of culture and how we live it.
Absolutely, no worries. I think that's a very important concretization, let's say, of my point, that indeed, like, relativism sounds like a good idea until you're faced with something that you can't accept. It sounds like a good idea. We need to accept everything until you can't. And that's, again, when you get the fight or flight reaction, and you maybe even get this kind of self-criticism or what should I have done. And I'm not saying there's an easy way out of that. Let me be completely honest about that. If your circle of influence is limited, that can be really difficult. But I think it can be better. There are better possibilities to maintain, I think, a sense of self-integrity in those situations. And I'll get to that. But again, so that's one pitfall of the relativism, is you enter into a moral vacuum where you're not supposed to judge, even if you feel you have to. And the other point is, I think that it limits, if you take that to heart, it limits our ability to communicate and to go and to engage in dialogue. Because if the notion is that in the end of the day, I can never really understand what happens in that other system, in that other moral universe, if that is not my moral universe, I can never really understand it. How can I actually ever communicate with people? Why would I even engage? Right? So it almost discourages people from real interaction, from real dialogue, from real conversations. So again, I'm not saying there is no easy way out, but I think the choice is to say there is no easy way out, and let's engage with that. So, and that's the system of pluralism that we advocate, which is merited by the way, by a Dutch philosopher called Henk Posé, that already wrote about this in the 90s.
Of course he's Dutch, yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Well, my reading list might be slightly biased. I'm guilty of that, like anyone.
No, absolutely, yeah.
But interestingly, hardly anyone picked up on that, because this discussion wasn't as big as it is now, right? And he basically, with a very, very long, winding philosophical analysis, I think it was his PhD, we tried to go beyond both universalism and beyond relativism in a system he called pluralism. And pluralism is the system of dialogue. So it says there is no easy way out. To assume that someone has the only and superior truth about reality, that's a sense of arrogance that historically, would be falsified every single time that we believe that we have the only truth about reality. But relativism is also a dead end for the reasons that we just mentioned. So we need to surpass both of these systems. And his system was a system of dialogue, where this could only work if we adhere to two, what he called supracultural norms, which is on the one hand, that of dialogue, that everyone has at least a moral obligation to explain to others why they do what they do, and then explain it to themselves as well, because we're blind to our own cultural beliefs. But if we're confronted with others, it might make us think. Right. So even if we've grown up with people, we're grown up with the idea that physically disciplining children is a great way, to get ahead. That makes sense if we've never seen anything else. But if we're then confronted with people that have other ways, not only should we, might we be challenged to explain that to other people, but we need to explain it to ourselves why we actually do this. And the other way is non-exclusion. So there's no reason to preventively, limit people's participation in that exchange. In other words, there can be no cultural or religious argument to exclude people. Because if we allow that, then the whole thing will fall apart.
Yeah.
So if we have cultural arguments to say, I don't accept women, people of color, people of other sexual orientations as my equal, then the whole system will fall apart. Right? Because who could, then everyone can use that argument in any kind of situation.
Yeah.
Which is not to say it's always easy, again, but it means, again, going into the muddy, dirty field of conversation, dialoguing, exchanging, negotiating, with, and I think this is the most important thing, without a sense of superiority. So not because I think that my way is better, but because I think there may be basic human values that we can all aspire to, that lead us ahead, in which I'm not perfect either. And what these basic human values are is something we continuously try to figure out, right? It's not because I think female genital mutilation is not deplorable because I think so, because it doesn't exist in my moral universe. But because if I think about it, inflicting unnecessary pain on people, I think as a human being sounds like a bad idea.
Yeah, and I think that's the key point. We now know, objectively so, what's good for the human animal, right? We have enough knowledge, data points, to know that it's objectively good to live pain-free. We know that it's objectively good that, having a higher quality of life where you are healthier is good for the human animal. So therefore, nutrition, water, shelter.
Exactly.
There is enough knowledge out there. It's just how we build that bridge with those who don't necessarily have that knowledge. And I think that's, you keep mentioning the word dialogue, and I really like that, because dialogue implies a win-win as opposed to a debate, right? And we've talked about this. You and I certainly talked about this before. But the difference between a dialogue and debate is that very point. That debate is a winner takes all type of thing, whereas a dialogue is a win-win situation.
Exactly.
And I guess that's to kind of take it to the subtitle of your book, which is the quote that I've cited a number of times in papers that I've written, and I mention it all the time. I just love it. It's catchy. I teach this stuff, and I open up with, cultures don't meet, people do. Because I think it speaks to this very point. But maybe I'll throw across to you to tell me a little bit about how did you come up with that, and what does it actually mean?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the references, first of all, obviously.
I'm not even kidding. Anybody that's been in any of my classes over the past year and a half will certainly attest to me using that quote.
There you went again. Said it again today. I'm guilty of that myself. No, I mean, sure. I think basically that was, of course, when we started thinking about titles, that was one of the first titles that we came up with, because it's indeed also a one-liner that we have both used in our sessions so often. And I think, again, it's interesting in that context where we have learned to see culture in a certain way, it becomes such an eye-opener for people. Because on the one hand, yes, you need to have that awareness that there are different realities. And mainly, I think the main thing is that means that my reality is not the only reality, right? And for that, this notion of culture is very useful. But at the same time, if then the problem is that it limits our interaction, it limits our capacity to truly connect and engage with others. Because this whole notion of meetings between cultures makes it sound very complicated and very challenging. And I'm not saying it's not complicated and challenging, but the thing is, you can't communicate with a culture. In a way, cultures don't really exist. It's an abstraction. Again, like we said, it's a concept we invented to analyze the social world. And by the way, most people now in social science would acknowledge that you can find culture in any group. It doesn't only exist within national groups that have some magical cultural boundary. Why would that exist?
Well, it's the idea of imagined communities, right? I mean, that's the Benedict Anderson. I mean, that's
exactly.
It's exactly that. It only exists because we give it we bring it into existence. The same as nations, flags, borders, etc., etc. It is a no, that makes sense.
And then part of it is to see through that trick and to say, okay, in the end of the day, we might see things differently. As you know, I might as well with my neighbor who happens to have the same nationality. Mm-hmm. We might see things differently as well. But there is a universal process of communication that we can always engage with. And we can always talk to someone. And again, it might be challenging. But if we approach it as a meeting of cultures, it becomes this very heavy notion where people might even shy away and think, I can't, again, like you said before, I can't change culture. I know you can't. But you can talk to a person and you can, to some degree, influence and maybe change a person. So when it comes to these very, very difficult, admittedly, situations that you just sketched, you can't change a whole population's norms around gender relations or about adult-child relations. And maybe you can even change one person's mind, but you can make them think. Right? You can present them with an alternative without pushing your reality on them and saying, like, this is how we do it. You guys need to update. But by being curious about actually what they do and why they do it and explaining maybe how you see things, right? We have a case in our book of two young interns that went to a school, I think it was in Benin, and they also witnessed that these very kind, sweet colleagues that they worked with on a very regular basis violated the physical integrity of their students by corporal punishment, like very severe corporal punishment, until children were lying on the floor, crying in pain. And they couldn't connect these two things of their sweet, helpful, supportive colleagues with this notion. And at least for the time that they were there, they addressed this without trying to sound superior, but trying to understand what they did, but also tell them what they saw. They said, we see children that have all kinds of reasons, for example, why they're late, that live in very stressful and difficult circumstances, come late and get flogged. And we see that they're in pain and we see that they're suffering. And it's very difficult for us to see this. And, you know, I'm not saying this was an easy conversation. As I understand it, the principal of the school didn't immediately say, oh, okay, you're absolutely right. We never thought about this. Let's change it. But at least they actually stepped away from corporal punishment for the time that these interns were there. And we don't know what happened afterwards. And I'm not saying it was perfect ever after, but they made them think. They made them think. Yeah. And if you don't have the authority to really change things, making people think is a really, really good opportunity.
Yeah. And it also brings to mind of another point, you know, this idea that we seem to have embraced of, you know, nation building in our more recent conflicts, where we'll go and we'll instill democracy and, you know, human rights and so on, without actually understanding the local context, and actually understanding what is the, you know, every human behavior has a reason for existing, right? So to unpack that, as opposed to, like you were saying, you don't just force your opinions on it. You need to understand firstly what's driving this behavior and where the roots are. And I don't think, and this is certainly something I've addressed in this podcast with various guests about, and a prime example that always comes up is Afghanistan, where we embraced such black and white narratives of, you know, anybody that's shooting at us is Taliban, and, you know, anybody that smiles at us is on our side. You know, I'm simplifying it, but that was generally the narrative that we like to embrace. But when you start peeling underneath that, there's an entire ecosystem that exists of how power is shared, of how beliefs and values influence who's who, how the money flow will influence the environment, something that we never really understood. But this is all part of this ecosystem that we then slap a label on and we call it culture. Maybe this is a good time to ask, how do you define culture, right? Because I think we need to zero in on that a little bit so that we have, because there are so many definitions, right? I mean, it is one of those terms, but how do you define culture? How do you view it?
It's a really good question. And as you said, there's a multitude of definitions. And it's safe to say that in social science, it's one of the most controversial concepts to define. We use one definition in our book which is honestly just a summary of many other definitions, which is to say culture is a complex set of habits that characterize a social group. Why I like to call it that is because that implies it is not a thing. It's not, there's culture lying around somewhere, and you can draw a clear line around a group of people and say, well, this is culture. It's always been there. Will always be like this. Which again, in many of those discussions, I think takes away so many nuances around, for example, democracy and whatnot, and state nation building, that we need to understand what's going on. And it also means it can apply to any group. And it can imply on different levels, right? In Afghanistan, probably the culture. I'm anything but an Afghanistan expert, but I feel very secure to say that there's probably very strong regional differences in how people behave and how they live and how they see the world. There's differences in different social levels between the upper class and the middle class and the working class. There's still different religions and different religious currents within Afghanistan, right? Yeah. And another important point is, if we see it as a complex set of habits can change. There's the famous pictures of Afghani women in the 1960s in Kabul walking around with short skirts. So there's no timeless Afghan culture that was shot into Afghanistan at some point and never changed and explains everything that happens. It's a complex set of events that builds people's perception of reality. And that part of that is, political developments that happened in the last decades. I won't go into detail, and I'm not an expert, but, from what I know and my knowledge, there's many political events, global political events that made certain branches of religious interpretations become dominant in Afghanistan that were not dominant before. And that shaped people's worldview. And these got momentum, they got power, they got money, they got weapons.
Yeah.
And, what we're looking now is the result of many of those developments. And again, I'm not an expert in Afghanistan, but because, faced by the way that I look at culture, this is what I see.
Yeah. And I really like the idea that it's a complex set of habits because, and as you said, habits can change, but also habits are oftentimes unconscious, right? Which is a habit. Absolutely. You just do it. It's a behavior that's developed over time. I just think about myself as a formerly a heavy smoker. It was a habit to smoke, at certain events. In the morning with my coffee, I would have a cigarette. I wouldn't even think about it. And this is why I really like your point about dialogue, because once you start identifying and mentioning to people, hey, this is, the way you do things is definitely different the way we do it. I wonder why you do it. Even that simple question will
absolutely
ask someone to reflect on their own behaviors that they might never have actually asked the question. Why do we beat children for being late? Why do we flog them? Is that actually necessary? While, like you said, you might not change much, there's a chance that you'll plant a seed of question. Exactly. You create a sufficient bumper for someone to make him think of an alternative. And I guess that's what that's how culture changes. And culture is, 50 years ago, in Australia, which is a progressive, democracy, gay and lesbian marriage was a pipe dream,
Exactly.
Whereas now it's not even in some circles probably still is an issue, but broadly speaking, it's not even discussed, right? So culture morphs and changes. So, and in the book, you have a particular model that you use, right? The TOPOI model. What is the model? Describe the model.
Right. Yes, there is a model, and I'm always a bit hesitant because I personally don't like models myself, right? So. There is a model, but there's at the same time I have a lot of disclaimers about how to use models in reality. But it can still be helpful as a tool and in other ways. But so many approaches to intercultural communication, again, take their starting point in this history I sketched before, right? The anthropologists came with the notion of culture, relativism, and comparing cultures as you call them, ecosystems on a whole. Which is useful in a way, but unuseful in another way. Because I just said, if cultures don't mean what people do, right, the chances of someone completely adhering to the cultural system that you associate them with are actually not that great.
Yeah.
Right. So many of these well-known models that you mentioned, many of them actually developed by my fellow countrymen. Like you mentioned, Hoopstede, Fondstompenaars. There are nuances between these models as well, but at least their starting point very often is to say that we're going to kind of predict an interaction and analyze an interaction based on people's national membership, assuming that there is great coherence in the values, norms, and habits of the people within this group. And okay, we only have one podcast, so I'm not even going into the methodological or the theoretical limitations of these models. But if we even look at it empirically, we just look at the actual data and we take it at face value, then people have done what is known as meta-analysis and looked at all the evidence of these kind of models, and they've seen, yes, it is possible to find patterns in values and habits and norms based on this data in national groups. But A, the differences within these countries are bigger than between them. And B, there are other collective memberships like education level, like organizational membership, like profession, like income, etc., that are better predictive of these values, norms, and habits than nationality.
So,
and I think
I just need to, that first one you said, I think I don't want to gloss over that the difference within a culture is oftentimes bigger than between cultures. That's what you're saying?
Well, let's replace culture with nationality, because if we use culture as a very broad concept, it can also refer to our organization. It can also refer to our professional group, etc. Right? So on the level of nationality, at least, which is what culture is normally associated with, at least in these models it is, then even empirically, and again, there's also lots of theoretical and methodological criticism of these models. Even though they have their merits, I'm happy. I used to be very critical, but I'm older now and I'm milder. But even if we acknowledge their merits, we have to see the criticism for what it is as well. And even just, again, if we take them at face value, the differences within national groups are bigger than between them. So to say, let's say you're an Australian, you're going to interact with a person from China, the encouragements of these models would be to say, okay, then you just look up how you score as an Australian on, let's say, power distance, right, which is your sense of hierarchy, which is, presumably by this model very low. And you meet a Chinese person, and presumably their association or interpretation of hierarchy is much higher. Then that may make sense in a collective sense, but on the individual level, that's a very, very dangerous expectation or assumption to make, because there's huge differences within these groups, bigger than between them. So the chance of you actually meeting someone that completely conforms to, let's call it what it is, the stereotype that could come forward from these models is actually, even statistically, quite small. If we look at the evidence that these models are based on.
Which is why cultures do not meet, people do, right?
Thank you. Exactly.
No, but and I mean, I know I keep referring to it. I just love it because it when I deliver these lessons, it allows me to pin that up as the principal statement that I then will go to, because the courses that I teach, a lot of them really rely on person-to-person communication, right? And what this allows me to then start peeling back on is, well, hold on, we're all human, right? What are some of the fundamental human, and oftentimes we'll go to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, even though, there's been some work done to refine Maslow's thinking, and, he certainly never had a pyramid he never pictured it as a pyramid as we depicted.
Right, with many of these theories,
but it's certainly a very helpful tool to then set into context. Okay, so, why do people do different things? What is driving this behavior? And as we said before, every behavior in whatever ecosystem has its roots in a cause. And if you can start peeling back on which particular need, whether it's a security need or the physiological, emotional, spiritual, whatever type of need it actually meets, once we start understanding that, we can actually connect to that person, as opposed to trying to view them through 6 dimensions or 7 dimensions or whatever, depending on which book we pick up, and try to kind of score them in there. undoubtedly we swim in that. Undoubtedly, all of us swim in that, and it certainly leaves its traces. And I always say to people, it's always good to have that knowledge in the back of your mind,
right?
Because that's the context, that is the social context the person lives in or swims in, but you can still touch the person, right? You can still build a bridge. Yeah,
exactly. One thing I'd like to mention before I get to the model then is how we view culture in our approach is to say it basically gives people a repertoire, right? So it's our frame of reference with which we go through life of things that we are familiar with, right? And that's why, again, you can see these patterns on a national level because they do form our frame of reference, right? So it's, as you call it, it's our ecosystem. It's what we're used to, but that doesn't define or predict how we personally, individually act on those things. So I may be used to people going camping and eating raw herring because I'm a Dutch person. I hate both of these things myself, but I'm familiar with them. So if you engage with me on the level of, you probably do these things yourself, then it's wrong. If you think it's my frame of reference and you're curious how I act on these things, that is a much better way. Yeah. So I'm not saying all of this knowledge is completely useless, but again, it's a background for reflection and to learn, and mainly to learn about ourselves and then to engage with people that are different. And that's, sorry for the long-winded introduction. That's where the model comes in.
No, that's great.
So what makes the model different then, again, it doesn't emphasize culture as such, but it emphasizes communication. So TOPOI is an acronym that stands for different levels where communication can get distorted. In particular, in what we see as intercultural interactions, but basically it goes for any interaction. It's just that we apply it on what we see as intercultural interactions. Where, again, and that's where the disclaimer is that our intention is absolutely not to tell people you need to TOPOI every interaction now from beginning to end. No, because that will slow down your natural, spontaneous, communicative competences that you already have as a human being. But as we said, to engage in dialogue, to be aware of what you take for granted, which may not be taken for granted for the other person, and vice versa, that you have different reference points, different social realities in which you live, but that you can connect and try to understand each other. And then if communication breaks down, TOPOI is a tool to figure out where that might come from. So you have these 5 levels or areas that you can use as a kind of scan, or we've also envisioned it as a lens to zoom in on a miscommunication, a communication breakdown, and try to figure out what could I do to repair that or to improve that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what is it? What does the acronym stand for?
Right. So TOPOI is incidentally, or not completely incidentally, also Greek for the places, right? So it's also the places where communication takes place and can break down. And in a way, culture exists on all these levels, but maybe more pronounced on some of them than in others. And on every level, on every area, there's 3 reflective questions, which is, what am I doing that makes the other person act this way? What is the other person doing that makes me act this way? And what is happening in the social context that makes us act this way, which is what we call systems theoretical approach, which means that we assume communication is always flowing back and forth. And it's easy to say that person is acting that way because he's just like this, or she is just like this, or they are just like this. But we could also say, well, maybe I'm doing something that makes this person act this way. So I'm building up the tension for the acronym, you know this. Right? But
You're doing well. You're doing well.
Let's say that I'm lecturing a class and I'm asking questions and the class is completely silent, right? Then the easy way out is to think, there's something wrong with these students. Why aren't they speaking up? They must be tired or lazy, uninterested or stupid, right? Which is our first intuition. And this approach would force me to think, what am I doing or not doing that stimulates them to answer and to ask questions. Right. So the first question is with me. And what is, how are they impacting me? Maybe in a way, maybe they're doing something subconscious that makes me act in that way, that makes them not invite me. And there's maybe something in the social context. Maybe something happened in the news last night. Maybe that, student allowances just got cut last night and they have something completely different in their mind, right? It might be neither of our faults. And we apply this on all 5 levels in the acronym. So the T stands for tongue and has to do with everything in language. So something we often forget, aside from culture, there's linguistic differences between people, which impacts our understanding. we may speak in a lingua franca that neither of us has a high command of, or one of us has a high command of, right? Which impacts our communication, whether we like it or not. I feel this every time I speak to a British person, for example. You know, and they will use catchphrases and jokes I can't come up with, right? We had a colleague, for example. Let's not give him. No, he was very empathetic in that sense. But you know, if they speed up, you know, I'm lost.
And it's a really good point, because I mean, I think something as native English speakers, certainly in Australia, it was something I've brought up a few times, is to bring awareness to it. That in a coalition environment where English is the dominant language, there is a power differential that comes purely through the fluency with which one can command the dominant language. That brings power. And you see those who don't necessarily command the language as well, firstly lose confidence, but also on the other side, from us as the dominant speakers, it's very easy for us to ascribe less favorable traits to those people purely because they don't speak the language. Right? They're just, you know, they're shy, they're not confident, or, you know, they're stupid, or
they have nothing to say.
They have nothing to say. Right? Exactly. Yeah. Exactly right.
Yeah. Very easily conflate linguistic ability with intelligence.
Yeah.
And then there's other things at a level of tongue. There might be accents that play a role, right? And accents that we value differently. There are studies that would show that a lecture held by someone with a fluent, like let's call it a native accent or a non-native accent, the intelligence of the speaker is rated differently, right? So it affects us in certain ways. We might have different associations with words, right? What I mean by deadline might be different than what you mean by deadline. We might have a misunderstanding. You think a deadline means absolutely do not cross this point in time. And I think deadline is kind of an indication more or less by then or not, you know? And then there is other language, which is nonverbal language, which is everything that we say without words, which is our intonation, our body language, the clothes we wear, the rooms we meet, and all these things might communicate something to the other person that is not communicating to you yet. So that's the whole, you know, it's a very complex field, but a very, very important field that's very often overlooked.
And having an awareness of that, I think, is even just an awareness of that is a massive head start, because I think it forces, and I think one of the other mistakes we often make is we try to study other people and other cultures and identify, you know, their traits, but we very rarely look in the mirror and look at ourselves, right? What is our own vulnerabilities? What are our own blind spots? What are our own social norms, habits, heuristics, behaviors that govern how we do things, how we speak? You know, how is my accent perceived, or how is my body language perceived? And we don't really have a right to judge or study someone else until we really understand ourselves. And I think, funnily enough, the moment you start understanding yourself, you'll automatically develop more empathy, you know, for someone else.
Absolutely. Yeah. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So then the next, the O in the acronym, what's O stand for?
Stands for order, which means our views and logics. So it's basically, this is where, again, culture is somehow relevant in all these fields, but here it's the most explicit. So this field very explicitly asks us, how do we view the world? And what is our logic through which we view the world? What do we take for granted? What do we find normal in terms of hierarchy, in terms of how we view time, right? I'm fascinated by time, because when you think of it, time doesn't exist, right? It's a human invention to coordinate. Yeah. But there is no such thing as time. We invented it. So if you realize that, it makes it much easier to realize that what you see as time is different than what other people see as time, right? And what kind of notice people think, you know, what kind of time frame people have in mind and how they experience that is vastly different.
And how important it is to them.
And how important, there is other things, like gender relations is one thing, but, you know, one famous thing is what often goes under the flag of individualism and collectivism. And I have some problems with those terms, but at least a notion of how much do we cultivate, right? So I think culture one way to think of culture is it's cultivation. It comes from the Latin word cultura, which means to cultivate, right? So it's not to say that people in what we call individualistic societies are egoists and don't think of other people, and people in what we call collective societies, even if I don't like those terms, don't have any self-interest, but it's what is cultivated in a group. So we can cultivate, which happens in what we call Western societies. We often cultivate a sense of self, our individual path, our individual development, our individual responsibilities and whatnot. And other people might cultivate social harmony. They might cultivate their belonging in a group, et cetera, fitting into a group, without saying that they don't have anything of the other side, right?
Yeah.
But it does shape our view of self and others, and perhaps our behavior. If I think that personal development is very important, and I feel very comfortable talking about that, for example, in a job interview, I might assume if I'm interviewing someone that has been socialized in a worldview that cultivates social harmony and modesty and loyalty, I might judge that person as, oh, this person doesn't have any ambition. And that person might just be thinking I'm trying to be modest. Right? So we have different worldviews and different logics and different things we take for granted in situations. And that's what the first O stands for. Yeah,
absolutely. And again, that resonates so strongly with me. And again, it's how we've ordered the world that we live in.
Exactly.
It explains how the world works, right? It's the architecture of a particular society or a particular ecosystem. And if you don't invest the time and effort to understand the order, how people see the world in a particular space, environment, social group, ecosystem, etc., then you have really no chance of understanding or building a true bridge of understanding with their worldview. Okay, so moving on. So what's the P stand for?
The P stands for persons. So this stands for identity and relations, which is another thing I think is very often overlooked or underestimated or underconceptualized in intercultural theory, because it stands for the level of, what we call the relationship level of communication. So we have a task level or a content level of communication in theory, where we exchange, what we're doing now in a podcast, right? We're deep diving into content. We're talking, it's about the message that we want to deliver, right? So we'll say to someone, you did a really good job, which is the message I want to deliver. But there's a relationship level where we communicate how we see the other person, or more complicatedly, where the other person might interpret how he or she is seen. So even a well-meant compliment, like, you did a really good job, might, on the relationship level, communicate to this other person, oh, you didn't expect that from me? Did you have low expectations?
Of course.
And I think, if we see that through an intercultural lens, and we see that in the context of cultural diversity or ethnic, national, religious diversity, I think it immediately becomes apparent that what we communicate about how we see the other person is essential. And I think a lot of misunderstandings can be brought back to these aspects, because how we see other people is partly shaped by what we call social representations, or single stories, or narratives, or discourses that we're fed from society, or fed from global influences. And that builds expectations of what we have of other people. And very often, unconsciously, we project that on certain people, and we have certain expectations of, oh, this person is from this or this group, so they're probably very conservative, or, oh, they're from this group, so they've probably never heard of this Netflix show that I watch every day. Or we don't. How do we overcome that?
How do we overcome that? Because that strikes me as a particularly real problem, and one that's because we live in stories, and stories that explain the world. So how do we challenge that bias, I guess?
Well, part of the answer is, unfortunately, is a sad truth, is that we don't completely overcome it, at least, right? Because we can't, because we have it for a reason, right? We have expectations in our mind of people. We categorize people for a reason, which is probably, our cognitive survival, because we would go nuts if we would have to judge every bit of information on its own merits. So we can't completely overcome it. We can become more mindful of it, though, of the process itself. of the narratives that surround us. There's a scholar in Sweden that calls it discourse awareness. We can become more aware and recognize the discourses that we're fed about groups of people and about society and about others, and become more critical of it. And we can start to recognize those moments when it impacts our communication. So it takes a critical awareness, and it takes effort. And it, first of all, takes the recognition, which is the most important step, that we are affected by this. So I've had people in programs that, and I'm not making this up, that, you do an introductory round in the beginning. Who are you? Why you're here? And sometimes people would literally say, I don't know why I'm here, because I don't have any stereotypes. I don't have any biases. I don't need this training. And my answer is always, okay, then you need to go to a lab now and get yourself examined, because you're not a human being. Right. So the first step is we need to do is to accept that we, unavoidably have this stuff in our heads. Every single human being has. And then to work from there. There's a quote I love to use, and I normally don't say who it's from in my lectures. And if people listen to my lecture afterwards, don't give the clue to others. But it's a quote that says something of, someone once said, I saw that the pilot was black and I had to suppress my panic. How could a black man ever fly a plane? And I'll do a round of expectations. Who uttered this extremely biased, prejudiced phrase? Last couple of years, the standard answer was Donald Trump. I don't know who they'll come up with next, but and the actual answer is it was Nelson Mandela, who admitted that he himself was impacted by what he called his apartheid conditioning, that he himself had absorbed the stereotypes of his own group on their level of intelligence and competence, and made him panic when he saw the pilot in the plane he was going to fly was black and wondered, will I survive? Yeah. And my message is always it's on two levels. It's on the one hand, if Nelson Mandela has this, who are you to say that you are immune to this, right? And on the other level, you can be impacted by this and still be a pretty decent human being and do good things for the world. Yeah. And again, very often in our communication, we incidentally and implicitly communicate these kind of expectations, these kind of things. And if we're not aware of that, it might do damage. And if we are aware of it, it might still do damage. And I want to steer away also from another discourse, which makes everyone, guilty and culpable and find easy ways to point at victims and perpetrators and guilty and innocent people. That's not my intention at all. My intention is to say we're all impacted by this. Yeah. We need to be open to the opportunity, the option that it impacts our communication. And because it's almost unavoidable, if that happens, to say, okay, I'm sorry, I messed up, did something wrong, or actually maybe my understanding is biased. Can you help me understand? Yeah. And instead of, revolting or how do you say, resorting to a kind of self-pitying of, oh, I'm such a bad human being. That's not what this is about. Yeah.
No, I agree. And I think the idea of biases are, they're useful. We have them for a reason. I mean, you're making that point. There's evolutionary reason in protecting the in-group versus the out-group. I hear it so often, and I've seen this quote in various ways. But we have our brain as it is now is 100,000 years old. And it served us well then, and it's the same brain that we've got now, except the world is vastly different. 100,000 years ago, it made sense that anybody different signaled danger and threat because, we lived in small groups, and it was in my interest to protect my own group against the raiding other group, whoever they were, who were going to steal our resources. And, and we have this programming exists for a reason, but oftentimes in today's world, it misfires, and intercultural, grouping is a natural setting where this system will misfire. But I think just knowing that system exists and that system is fundamentally good because it is about self-preservation. Right. However, knowing that it's, hey, right now it's misfiring and why, how am I contributing or,
Exactly. No, absolutely. And at the same time, that system is fed by certain social representations. Yeah. And we can't change the system, but we can challenge the social representations that we're fed. I even read a paper the other day, which made me think, because I've also thought about this as bias for a very long time, but I read an article by a British linguist that actually protested against the whole notion of bias in this context, because he says not necessarily a bias in terms of, that means it's a distortion of reality, but he basically focused on, we are fed social representations that make us predict reality in a certain way. Without saying there's a right or a wrong way to see that, we build an expectation. And that in itself is a normal human thing, but it might not serve us, and it might not do justice to the people that we actually meet, right? There's a funny inverted relationship for me about the more that I've learned about cultures and cultural differences, because there is knowledge to acquire, and it helps us to build scenarios and expectations of possibilities, at least, right? Yeah. But at the same time, what it's done for me is that it takes away many of the expectations to say, like, well, it's so complex, I have no idea who's across the table. Let me find out. And I have scenarios and opportunities in my head that I may like, maybe it's something like this, maybe it's something like that. But it makes me less and less convinced that I'm right. And I increasingly laugh about myself that so many of the interactions I have do not at all confirm the expectations that have been developed in my head.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's spot on. It's it's slightly unrelated, but it triggered a thought in me, and that's how Brené Brown's definition of empathy, which I really like, and how we build empathy with people from vastly different backgrounds, circles to our own, is to try and connect to the emotion underpinning an experience as opposed to the experience itself, which I think speaks to that point slightly, in the sense that it's about realizing what is the programming that I'm carrying about this person. What am I projecting on this person that's shaping and influencing how I understand them? Yeah. But the reality is, I haven't walked in their shoes. I haven't lived their lives. I haven't, everything I have in my mind is merely a projection. But what I can do is I can connect to the emotion that they felt, because we all feel the same emotions. We all feel fear, joy, sadness, etc. It just might have been produced in different circumstances. And to build a connection to somebody, about a particular, we've all lost somebody we love, right? So it's just whether, and this is, in a military context, whether they're, that counterpart that I'm working with in Iraq, whether, their family was killed in war and mine died a peaceful death, the emotion, the sadness, the anguish is still the same. Absolutely. And that's where we can connect, right? That's where I can see the person, understand the person. I can never understand or try to pretend to understand what it feels like to lose your family in a suicide bomb attack or whatever, right? But I can connect to the pain, the anguish, and I think that's it. So that's kind of, it was a long way around, but I do think that there's a link to, how we see a person, and I guess to the P of the TOPOI model.
It's a very clear link. And also, thanks for building that bridge, because I said the P is for person, for identity and relationship. And what you addressed there very beautifully is this aspect of relationship where beyond all these perceptions, we can build a connection of trust with people. And I think also in many ways, if we do manage to build that human to human relationship, a lot of the faux pas, as they're seen, in terms of cultural etiquette or in terms of the stereotypes I might have about people, will be forgiven if I have that connection and that trusting relationship. So the question is also, have I focused on that sufficiently, right? So I see international cooperation sometimes go wrong, again, especially nowadays, we've all been online. But if you only communicate with a counterpart without ever meeting them face to face, sitting down over a meal, exchanging, information about our lives, everything becomes about negotiations and the nitty-gritty stuff, right? Yeah. But once we meet human to human, you will, almost all situations, so this is a deeply human phenomenon, it will go a lot easier.
Yeah, that's, again,
it's an investment.
Yeah, exactly. And I have to, again, bring in another anecdote that comes to mind, and that's in a previous life when I worked in the liaison space in the military, and we used to refer to it as the rapport bucket. And we this was passed down to us as a way to think about interpersonal connection. So every person you meet, imagine this completely empty bucket between you and that person. And your goal is, with every interaction you have with that person, is to pour just a little bit of rapport into that bucket. And you build that rapport by the things that you're saying, to get to know the person, ask about them, find out about their family, about their friends, about their interests. Right. You'll find that there's a lot of similarities, even though overtly you might be completely different. But, exactly. you might both love football, right? And there's, you can certainly pour a lot of rapport, if you follow the same football club, or, if you both have dogs or whatever it is. And the goal being that, you build such a dense relationship, such dense rapport with that person, that imaginary bucket is overflowing. And when that bucket is overflowing, like you were saying, that's when you've got genuine trust. If you make a faux pas, cultural or otherwise, you're going to just take a little scoop out of that rapport bucket, but the rapport bucket is so full that it'll be just laughed at. Whereas if you haven't invested into that rapport bucket, where you haven't poured any, like you were saying, you didn't work on that relationship, on that trust, and the rapport bucket is empty, a faux pas you make, it's going to be detrimental to that relationship. Exactly. because you have no excess rapport that you can use.
There's no buffer.
No, that's right. Yeah, exactly. You've shot a hole in the bucket. But yeah, that's an anecdote that we use quite a lot and have used in the past, and I've always found it quite useful in my own interpersonal engagements.
That's a great man. Yeah.
I'm just conscious of our time as well. I'm loving this. I could do this for 3 days, but.
Yeah, me too.
And we have done this for 3 days in the past. Exactly. But what is the second O in the model?
Sure, that stands for organization. And interestingly enough, that was actually originally not in the model, because the model is, to make things more complicated, it's an application of a well-known communications approach by Paul Watzlawick, which has 4 dimensions. And
we cannot not communicate, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's one of that guy. And organization was originally not part of that. But we've just seen in so many case analyses that the organizational context was so pivotal to what was going on, that people focused on, is this an issue of identity? Is this an issue of language? Is it an issue of culture? No, it's just a problem in the organization. To give the most extreme example, one of the most extreme examples I've seen was an NGO that had an office in Latin America. And they were in the Netherlands in their head office, and they requested an intercultural training about this country specifically, because they felt communication is not going it's not going very well. And we said, okay, what can you tell us about the problems? And they said, there seems to be distrust, and maybe it's something in their culture. And but first let's analyze what's going on and what the situation is. And what turned out, and they forgot about this, don't ask me how, but they had actually had doubts about the integrity of this office and ordered an integrity investigation of this office. And they were freed of all charges and forgot to tell them. And they seemed distrustful in the communication afterwards. Well, big surprise. So before you even need to bring in culture, aspects of cultural identity or language, if that is the context in which you're operating organizationally, no wonder, right? And of course, this may get further amplified by linguistic, cultural, and identity issues. But the core of the problem, the root of the problem, is in this organizational issue. And we see that time and time again, that organizational issues are the root problem, and maybe they're amplified by these other things. But if you don't look at those issues, if you don't look at how clear, for example, is the organization in communicating something to a very diverse population, there's a big chance that those things will be interpreted in all kinds of different ways, right? Which is good to have understanding of those other things and there's other factors. But if the root of the problem is that you're not communicating it clearly from an understanding that people have other taken for granted assumptions and interpretations, it's gonna come back at you.
Well, how does it again, without putting you on the spot too much, but how does one challenge that? Because it seems, coming back to this kind of cultural relativism piece, we can't accommodate every possible relativistic view. No. Right? And that's not what I know. That's not what you're saying. But how do we then help those who are drafting the messages to get the most out of it?
Well, sometimes it's just about clarity and explicitness, right? So a classic example is I've worked with a lot of schools, and then you have schools that, for example, decide that they organize a camp in the beginning of the academic year, right? And this was a school, and this was for higher education in the Netherlands, where new students were about 17 years old. Many of them lived with their parents, and they would start a camp, organize a camp in the beginning of the academic year. And this was compulsory, this was mandatory, and it involved a sleepover in unsupervised dormitories. Students started to protest against that because their parents didn't allow them. And in this case, the majority of those students had an immigrant background. And you can try to understand that, like, oh, they're morally conservative and whatnot and religious, and which is, maybe part of their motivation. Maybe there are other motivations. We don't really know. But the end of the story was that it became this very strong us versus them scenario. They need to adapt. We set the standards here. We only change if we want to, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas, one of the first questions that I had, did you communicate to students before they signed up for your program that there was a mandatory camp with unsupervised dormitories? No, we had not, right? So even if you decide that this camp, I would take issue with that person to say it's essential for succeeding this program that you need to go to a camp with unsupervised dormitories. But even if you do, the least thing you can do is then communicate, if you sign up for this program, this is what you're going to get. And if it objects to your moral views of the world, okay, then it's not for you, right? That exists, right? It sounds a bit cheesy, but some people have said you don't apply to a sausage factory if you're a vegetarian.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a cheesy one-liner, but there's truth in that. Like, sure, not everyone can cater to everyone. Yeah. The least thing we can do is be clear.
Yeah, honest and upfront about it. Yeah, absolutely. And then the last I.
Right. It stands for intentions. And in a way, it's maybe in a dialogical sense, the most important one, because that's where we look at what actually drives people in a certain context. Why do they do what they do? With, one of the mottos that we have is what is called as the hypothesis of the best, which means that in the end of the day, everyone has good intentions. This sounds incredibly naive, I know. And I'm not saying that those good intentions coincide with what you think is good, but it's good, it's logical, it makes sense from their view of the world. They are doing what they think is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
We quote in the book, I forgot her name, but there's a CIA agent, former CIA agent who turned human rights activist, who says in a very convincing video interview that, the one thing she learned from her work at CIA is everyone thinks that they are the good guys. Right. Again, and that may make them do things that are, in your view, or even in a common human view, abhorrible.
Yeah.
But what they're doing is they think that they are doing the right thing. And if that is your starting point, that makes you curious about people's motivations. And it makes you potentially able to recognize those intentions without agreeing with their effects. So we need to distinguish between effects and the intentions. But people are generally doing what they think is right, what they think is best. We may not agree with it, and we don't have to agree with it, but we can try to understand it. So there's a difference, again, between understanding and agreeing. And specifically, we also look at how much are we actively recognizing their perspective? Are we trying to understand what they're coming from and also recognize that they have good intentions, that they're trying to do the right thing? So these students that ask for exceptions, that they don't want to come to these camps, even if we don't agree with their motivations, we can say, okay, we can understand that you feel awkward about this from your point of view. And we can see that unsupervised dormitories are controversial, from your point of view, and that there's a problem with that for you. However, we have our reasons for doing this. Again,
I have my own motivations.
There's two holes in that argumentation from my personal point of view. But again, even if you would take that point of view, right? Or other things that I've seen of students that ask exceptions because they feel that a class about evolution theory, right, is not for them because they, from their religious point of view, they don't agree with evolution theory. You don't have to agree with it to show recognition. Okay, understand from your worldview, that you don't agree with that. And the point is actually you don't have to agree with it. It's a theory, right? We can discuss it, but I can recognize that they are trying to do the morally right thing from their point of view without having to agree with it. Yeah. And then there's different patterns we can run to recognition, but very often it leads to dismissal It's like, just don't be so difficult. Show me in your holy book where it says you can't follow this class. Or why are the students that have the same religious backgrounds? They don't have any problems with it. Why, just listen to them.
Yeah.
And that just ends up in what we call a truth battle, a battle of truth. So it's my truth versus your truth.
Yeah.
And one of the other one-liners we have is sometimes the shortcut is the way around. So by going around, we get easier to resolve than immediately going up front to the result.
Yeah, I like that, and I really like this idea of motivation, and we've kind of touched on it already. But it seems to me that motivation lies at the root of all conflict. It's my motivation; it's whatever motivates me that's clashing with what's motivating you. And I think, again, we spoke about this earlier, but if we really want to understand human behavior, we need to understand what motivates it, what needs and desires are driving that motivation and therefore driving that behavior. So I think it's quite neat that, you made the point that intentions perhaps is one of the principal pillars of the model. And I also do understand why you don't like models. We also don't want to fall into the trap of saying, here's a model, apply this. No, it's just it should serve as a trigger. It should serve as force you to take a pause and, well, here's some considerations for you, as opposed to it's a cheat sheet, right? Rather than a map to follow, so to speak.
Yeah.
But maybe you can give us an example of how you would apply or how you have applied, the tongue, order, persons, organization, intentions in intercultural settings.
Sure. So you're looking for like a case example or something?
Yeah, like a case study that would kind of that would bring this to life on how somebody listening to this could really try to use it.
All right. Let me think quickly. Well, one example that we like to use is from an educational context, but I think you can make the translation to other contexts as well. Where there was a study counselor who was talking to a student of immigrant background in this case. And this was in the Netherlands. And the student had failed the class because she was, quote unquote, not assertive enough in the classes. And she was at the study counselor and they talked about this. And then this was also by a student, by the way, that had a light handicap. And in the conversation, at some point, the study counselor asked her, is this because of your culture that you find it difficult to be assertive? And the student said, yes, I find it difficult to speak up against my parents at home as well. And the study counselor all of a sudden felt trapped because he realized, okay, if it goes against her culture, then can we actually demand of our students to be assertive? And on the other hand, we did agree that was an important part of our education, that it makes students assertive. So there's a conflict. But again, at the same time, if it contradicts with her culture and potentially the culture of many other students, maybe we can't hold on to this, right? So you see the classic relativistic clash there with no way out. And you could say he set up a trap for himself. And if I'm cynical, maybe a little bit of an easy way out for her to say, well, okay, this is the end of the story. And when we analyze that, we said there's all kinds of things that could be going on that can be explored. So if we follow the order of the model, the T for tongue, are there linguistic aspects to this? Could it be that, assertiveness means that she's not speaking up in class? Could it be linguistic ability? Could it be that she doesn't feel comfortable enough speaking up? On the other level, on a more core level, what does assertiveness actually mean, right? Is that clear to everyone? Does assertive mean the same thing to every person, to every people involved? What do we actually mean by that? Do we mean that people voice their opinion in class? That's a lot more of a clear label than just saying you need to be assertive. On the level of order, there can be different perspectives and worldviews in terms of how you view your relationship to others, how, again, like we discussed, how cultivated worldview of personal development and personal opinions versus a cultivated worldview of social harmony, where you might not want to speak up to offend someone. This is where probably normally people would dwell. And I would say it's one of the options, but there's other things. On the P level, what is the student's relationship to other students? And the fact that she has a small handicap, by the way, is not even discussed. Maybe that makes her uncomfortable in class. Maybe that's not accommodated for. Maybe that makes it difficult for her to speak up. On the level of organization, again, what does assertiveness mean? And why is it part of the program? Why have we organized in such a way that we judge students on the basis of assertiveness? Have we explained to them what it means? I think there can be good reasons, because this was an HR program, to say students need to be able to voice their opinion, right? Because as an HR person, you're obviously often speaking up against other concerns in the organization that go beyond HR. Sure, you need to be able to voice your opinion in a considerate dialogue, but that's a much more clear competence than just being assertive. And again, like we talked about before, is this clearly defined in the beginning of the program? No, it wasn't. Is it explained to students how they will be judged on this and what they need to do to adhere? No, it wasn't. And the level of intentions, what does she want, right? What is her motivation? And actually, when they asked her, is that she wanted to change herself. She said, I find this difficult to speak up against my parents. But does that mean, per definition, that you can't learn to voice your opinion in other contexts? Is she motivated to do that or not? And she was. It bothered her that she couldn't do this. So then, again, you have a constructive dialogue instead of just stopping at, oh, it's her culture or not. And that means, there's some kind of magical line that makes us unable to change. And so in the end of the day, she did go to a course to learn to voice her opinion more clearly and to, while being considerate and avoiding conflict, still speaking her mind. And the organization, the program, decided to be much more clear on what they expected, how they measured this, and how it actually played a role in this professional context that they were preparing students to work in.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to really knowing what are your requirements, what are you trying to get out of a particular interaction relationship, and to know that will help you really develop the path to get there. And again, I know that we're really pushing up on our hard right shoulder, but maybe one last question that's
Sure.
Perhaps for my audience, which is mostly military, emergency workers, frontline workers, for any of those going into intercultural situations who might not have the time to go and read books about culture or learn about all the places that they're going to go to, because that unfortunately takes the back seat when other priorities are placed upon you, and that's life or death type questions. Arguably, this should be on there, and that's one of the things that I'm arguing for. But given that it's unfortunately at the moment not yet the case, how would you recommend? What is the best way to prepare for cultural shock? For if your aim is to build relationships with other cultures,
right?
Very easy question for you there.
Yeah. No, I was thinking that. It might sound a bit, how should I put it, simplistic or maybe even confronting, I don't know. But really the lesson, I think I've mentioned that before, but really the lesson that I've learned from all of this is try to engage without a sense of superiority. And this sense of superiority, that sounds a bit harsh, but that can take very, very subtle shapes, right? Because we might, again, underestimate people's capabilities and intelligence. We might have all kind of notions and think of who they are. We might think very implicitly deep down that what we do is always better than what someone else does. We have, this is again probably a human tendency. You phrased that very beautifully. That's tied down to our survival. But at the same time, part of our survival depends on how well we cooperate with other people. And for that, a sense of humbleness and trying to tame this sense of superiority that we're often motivated by implicitly and communicate in very small ways, that stands in the way of that cooperation. And at the same time, again, I can very consciously say steering away from a sense of superiority, because it doesn't mean that there is not always that there's not sometimes a better way to do things, right? We can think about, again, there's the ethical part. There's probably in many situations better ways to do things. But if we communicate that from a sense of superiority, it will be very difficult for other people to see that as well. If we see it as something that's in all of our benefit, that I've learned the hard way, and I, as an individual and as a group, learned the hard way that other people can benefit from, then we can have a conversation, right? It's like the human rights dialogue. I'm all in favor of human rights, but what often happens is that certain groups or nations appropriate human rights as their invention and teach the rest of the world how to respect human rights. How to
human,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Whereas if you look at the history of human rights, not to start that whole conversation, but it came also out of huge flaws and atrocities that happened in the West. And so to say it's not the West's invention, it's a human invention that we can all benefit and learn from, and that we can all improve it.
Yeah.
There's a very different dialogue than to say, I'm going to teach you how to do this. And that, that happens on the micro level as well. So to have that humbleness without excluding the option that there might sometimes be better ways to do things. And again, that for me is only summarized by trying to steer away from this sense of superiority, but engage.
Yeah.
Nonetheless.
Wonderful note to end on. Arjan, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I can hear there's a little young person that's been rather patient, So then I think
I don't know if it's patient, but let's see.
But I think your participation and your communication is required elsewhere. But I really do want to thank you for giving me so much of your time. It's been wonderful, and it's been great to catch up with you.
Truly.
I feel like it was only yesterday when we were sitting around coffee having these chats for an hour on end. Yeah.
Yeah, now we're on opposite sides of the world, but again, that's globalization and intercultural communication.
Yeah, exactly right. I really appreciate it, mate. And we'll be in touch.
Likewise. We'll be in touch. And again, many thanks for the interview. It was a really, really interesting conversation.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Voices of War. You can access all episodes on www.thevoicesofwar.com or by subscribing wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And while you're there, please give us a review, as we'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to recommend a guest for the show, you can reach me on info@thevoicesofwar.com.